Hello, listeners, and welcome to part 2 of this mini-series on the International Churches of Christ. Here is Laura. You mentioned wine, women, and dance, or something like that, and it made me think of like Bacchus with the little headband and the toga and like a big chicken leg and a big kind of vat of wine. Dance, women, and wine, which I can imagine, of course, it was not like that, but now in my mind, that's what Kim looks like. Um, and I recall during my conversation with Evie, they spoke about feeling really triggered now through hearing a cappella music and a really difficult experience that they had accessing a COC church outside of where they had grown up. So when they went off to college and were pressured into going to a COC church that was not racially diverse, that was not accepting of congregants that were not Caucasian or white, and having this horrific experience of social and religious racism that they'd never experienced up to this point. So you touched on that briefly before with your parents moving over to the ICOC, and the church was looking very much like it was practicing not a lot of segregation, not a lot of racial diversity. What were your experiences growing up in the ICOC in terms of acceptance of marginalized community groups? We've spoken about homophobia, so I know that one's probably off the table.
Yeah. No, I think this is another fascinating point because, anybody who has grown up in the ICOC or the Churches of Christ, especially the ICOC, I would just say the ICOC actually, but should read Kathleen Jenkins. She's a sociologist at the College of William and Mary. And she wrote this book called Awesome Families, The Promise of Healing Relationships in the ICOC, which is just an amazing title because it's exactly what they promise. They promise that they are going to heal you of all your addiction and all your troubles and all your, everything all your struggles by, creating this tight-knit family, unit, right? And this community, this extended family. But Kathleen Jenkins, she's so for writing that book, Awesome Families, she spent 2 years doing an ethnographic study of a family in the ICOC. I think one of her relatives might have been in the ICOC or something. But it's just a really fascinating book. It really helped me make sense of a lot of my childhood and my mindset, especially as a child, because I really had like an existential crisis at 12 when I like found out everything and I was like, what, but she also wrote a very interesting article in some sort of sociological journal about the multiculturalism within the ICOC and the interracial aspect of that church, because Kit McKean's wife is a light-skinned Latinx woman, and he would always brag. I guess he still does probably brag about, marrying this Latinx woman, and and that was just a big, selling point for him. And my experience growing up was, yes, like, and especially with the contrast of going to my grandfather's church and going to my grandfather's town and, Chattanooga, Tennessee, yes, the church looked a lot more diverse than the ICOC looked a lot more diverse. It is more, the congregations are more diverse in terms of the people showing up, right? Like the people that come into the doors. But and I haven't finished reading the article that Kathleen Jenkins wrote on this. And I can send it to you, and maybe you can link it or something later. But and other people have written about this too, within the white evangelical churches, right, throughout the United States, is that even multicultural churches, generally speaking, are not like. And so my experience was that, oh yeah, it looks more diverse, but growing up, like, I remember too, there being uh a lot of the Black congregants in my church would all sit together, like, and all the white people would, sit together. And so that was always confusing to me too, because it's like, okay, well, we're all came through the door, we're all here, but now we're all kind of finding our own space, right? Um, and I think that was part of Kathleen Jenkins, part of that article she wrote. But I think the main point that she makes, and again, other people have written about this too, especially people of color and Black Christians have written about, white evangelical churches that brag about being diverse and multi-ethnic, functionally aren't, because all of their leadership, and the people who really control the church are all white. The people in power are all white. The people who have money and who influence the church are all white, so there's like a lot of um presenting as looking one way but functioning very different. So for example, too, like, my best friend growing up in the church was very poor. Her mom was a single mom. And they were very harmed by the church. Uh my friend's mom was sort of looked at as a problem to be fixed as a single mom. So they set her up with this guy, and of course, they say that, again, you had to have approval for everything. In the ICOC, you have to, you cannot disagree too much, or else you are at risk of getting kicked out. But they set her up with this guy who ended up being, physically and verbally abusive, and just ruining their life, making their life hell. And they took no responsibility for it. And I can't remember why I was bringing that up, but I think I think for some people coming into the church, being a part of the community did really help and solve a lot of problems, like especially people who didn't have a lot of money, didn't, like you say, marginalized groups. So I guess that's why I'm thinking of them. They weren't people of color, but they were marginalized for sure because they were very poor. And it's just interesting how the conversations of race and class, I guess, within these coercive environments plays out. Like, but we were poor growing up too. We weren't as poor, but we didn't have a lot. And I think that was another reason my parents really were a part of the church, was because it's kind of helped them in some ways. It's funny, I met up with my friend from childhood. I think it was last year, maybe the year before. And she said, do you remember, we hadn't talked about church or anything in a long time. And she said, do you remember so-and-so? And I was like, I don't think so. She's like, do you remember their house? She was like, it was huge. And they had like a big slip and slide in the backyard. And I was like, I don't remember this, but I believe you. But like, there are just some of those things where, like, you found this community and they filled these needs for you, whether they were like internal needs or external needs, right? But it comes at a really high price. So the ICOC, and any other coercive group is ultimately not good for marginalized communities, not good for, very harmful for LGBTQIA, groups, any sort of marginalized people. Like, it's a very sort of band-aid approach, you know, the love bombing, right? Like, here, oh, we're going to help you, we're going to give you this, we're going to fix you, we're going to do that. And then over the year or two or three, you realize that, you know, that comes at a very high price. And again, the people at the top are all wealthy, white, and or, you know, at the very least, you know, very, you know, charismatic and persuasive and or whatever, but have some sort of level of influence and control. And all the people who really make up the church are all those people underneath, and they're the ones that are getting chewed up and spit out.
It's kind of like that gear analogy you used earlier, you know, the cogs that power the machine is benefited from those cogs, and at the top of that machine is leadership that I imagine don't live in poverty or don't live in environments where they're like, hey, desegregation happened years ago, but it didn't really happen, but we'll say it did, and then you'll soon realize it didn't. You know, I remember an interview with a lady named Barbara who talked to me about the worldwide Church of God, who positioned themselves as being racially diverse and accepting of said marginalized community groups that we've touched upon, or at least kind of underprivileged groups. But specifically on the topic of racism, said that they were a racially diverse and accepting church. And at a kids' disco that they held, a kids' Christian disco, everybody had to partner up uh, with the opposite gender. And there was one kid that didn't have a partner, and he was the only Black kid in the congregation. So they gave him a broom to dance with. And I don't know what kind of message that sends to the other children at that dance, or how that child must have felt being told that this was a racially diverse church and then being shown something that is the opposite of that. And I think about Erica Bourneman telling me all the time that KwaZulu in South Africa, they have the Zulu Nation congregants that are part of the KSB mission, and they say that, you know, oh, we have Zulu members. Of course we're racially diverse. There has never ever been an interracial marriage that has taken place in KwaZulu since its existence. So, you know, again, saying one thing and showing another. It that kind of says everything. But when I listened to your International Cultic Studies Association talk, which happened a couple of weeks ago now, titled "Every Part of Your Journey Matters: My Experience Growing Up in and Leaving the ICOC,"
Mm-hmm.
you talked about having, from what you could recall, a pretty happy childhood, which is not something you hear typically when you talk to survivors. The very specific parts of your experience that are different to some of the experiences we've heard on the show before are really poignant to point out, because when we hear these different experiences, and we know that there are so many different types of individuals that listen to the show that are at different parts of their recovery from toxic environments, cultic environments, high demand groups, it's really important to highlight these moments so that people can recognize similarities in their own experiences and know that they have not been on their own during these experiences. So
Yeah.
talk us through, what was your childhood like? What do you recall? Notable experiences, and then you get to this 12 mark and your existential crisis, as you called it.
Yeah. You know, to be honest, it's still hard for me to make sense of what really was going on in my childhood, in my family. Um, what I have described it as the highs were high and the lows were low. I do definitely acknowledge that my childhood was probably a lot better than most people who are coming out of coercive groups and cults. You know, you know, you just hear stories, and you know, I wasn't I don't know. It wasn't extreme, I guess, or egregious. Uh, and I think what's been the hardest thing about figuring out my childhood, and as I've talked to my parents and everything, is I've come to realize that my parents, I did as a child, I felt very loved by my parents. I did. But they often did things and didn't do things, didn't intervene or didn't, handle things appropriately and well. But also did do things that weren't right and were harmful. That were very confusing, because you're like, and I think I felt like I often in my childhood, like when my family, when we were doing stuff together, like we would take road trips and to go visit their parents, my grandparents. I definitely have some very happy childhood memories where I feel like I felt close to my family and I felt like belonging in my family. I think what was hard about that though was that it was wrapped up in the church. I don't know if it was, and I've heard people talk about families being cults, like that kind of can happen. I don't know if I wouldn't say that I was in a family cult, but I would say that the influence of the church influenced my family, and that there were some things that were very important to us as a family, like doing things together and having family time together, right? That I felt that I really enjoyed and really were sort of a foundation for me and a sense of like home and belonging, like right in my soul, but then there were things that happened that didn't that uh severed that, so we just, we had a lot of things like there, now we know like that you shouldn't like hit your kids. Like, I mean, that should be obvious, right? But like, I didn't even know that when I became a parent. Like we didn't do that. We didn't, do corporal punishment. I have never done that as parents, Um, but I didn't know when I was becoming a parent that was like so bad, like, like, so I don't know. I'm just confessing that here that I didn't know, like, but then you read the psychology and you're like, oh yeah, that makes total sense. Like that would actually make a child, like, why would I want my child to be scared of me? Like, what would this teach them? Like there are other tools and there are other ways of like teaching your child consequences that don't involve physical punishment, right? Um, so so there was that element of it that yes, we were like, physically punished at times. And, I do have memories of that and it being, very traumatic for me as a child, 5 years old. Like, it didn't really teach me much except again to be scared to do every little thing you said whenever you said it, so that I wouldn't feel this pain again and this humiliation, Um, so there are things like that that happened. And uh there were I have two older brothers who I am close with, and I'm generally close with my family now. I mean, I have dragged my parents to therapy with me, like and had hard talks with them, and when I didn't feel heard enough said, can you come to therapy with me again, so I've done all that and it's taken a while, but I do have a good relationship with them now. But I have two older brothers, and I was often sort of at the mercy of their taunts and their bullying, for lack of a better word. But excuse me, I don't hold that against them. I really hold that to my parents because they were children. And really there was not enough intervention and teaching. I think we forget that the word discipline means to teach, you know, but there was not enough teaching in those moments where, you know, we were taught, and somebody was, you know, I don't know, things were reconciled, you know, in an appropriate and good way. I just have a lot of memories of my brothers, you know, bullying me and doing things that made me end up, you know, crying in my closet, you know, from a very young age, you know, and my closet becoming like my safe place, you know, to just go cry, you know, as a child, which is like, I see my kids now. My kids are 7, almost 4, and 1.5. And like, if my oldest was like going and crying in the closet, like often, like I just can't even imagine something like that happening and us either not knowing about it or not doing something about it. Do you know what I mean? Like there are times when, and I admit that it's very hard too, as a parent, to stop what you're doing and to say, okay, like figure out what's happening, who did what to who, and to, you know, okay, you know, again, teach and say, okay, well, you know, if, you know, I know you want this thing, but right now he has it. So can you tell him like in a few minutes that you'll let him have a turn, or, you know, I don't know, do all the things, right? It takes time, it takes effort and intention and even thought. Like often I'll talk to my husband and I'll be like, I'll call him, I'll be like, I don't know what to do. Like, what do I say? Like, you know, what do I, you know, what's the natural consequence here? Like, I have no clue, you know? And he can be very helpful. But there are things like that that just didn't happen in my childhood. And like, again, like it wasn't just that I was failed, it was that my brothers were too, because they didn't learn how to. I remember even too having some conversations with both of my brothers. They were sort of different conversations because of the different things that have happened between us, but they both had apologized, you know, for things that they had done, and felt a lot of sorrow and regret and sadness looking back. And I feel bad for them. And I think I even told them, you know, mom and dad should have done something, you know, they should have, you know, and I want to say too, like that's why this is so important to me. I just have such a passion and a commitment, I guess, to people who grow up in these environments, because when you're a child in these environments, it's just so much to deal with. And a lot of times what the adults end up, I think what is, this was true of the ICOC, so I'm not sure about other cults, but children are looked at as second class citizens, you know, they're looked at as they're not people, you know, they are not their own people. They're almost like your property, you know, they're almost just something that you own, that's there for you. And they're there to do what you say, and to sit and not get in the way. But children are people. Children are people. And um, and yeah, they're looked on as not having any agency, you know, not having, yeah, just not even having their own personhood yet. But children are people. They are fully people. And they're just as much of a person as an adult, except they don't know all the things that adults know, which is why it's like the opposite of what you should think, right? We should be looking at children as people to be the most protected and the most you know, just patient and understanding and flexible and all these things, right? And giving agency and dignity to, right? But it's the opposite in a lot of these groups. And it was definitely that way in the ICOC. It definitely felt like we weren't really recognized until you kind of came of age, and you started like I said, that indoctrination process, of doing the studies and becoming what they call a disciple, but other than that, when you were a kid, you weren't, you just weren't given the time of day. And there's just so much neglect that can happen from that, so much neglect. And I would say that that's the best, I guess, word I could use, is that I know my parents loved me, and I know that they were doing the best that they knew at the time. And I say that throughout all the process of my relationship with them, from being a child to a preteen to a teenager, you know. But yeah, they were doing their best, but they did neglect me in a lot of ways. So it's just, and when you have that, I think my parents' motivation, like going back to the ICOC and that kind of influencing how they interacted as a family and how they prioritize things as a family, like that was good that they prioritized family time. But it was wrapped up in the church. Like even church time was more prioritized than family time. And so when we left the church, that was very confusing for me. And I felt like I didn't know how to exist in this family anymore, because, well, if everything about the church isn't true and we're not even going here anymore, like you told us we were going to go to hell, like other people are going to hell if they don't go here, right? Like, what does that mean for us? Like, I didn't know how to understand my family anymore, and like what we were even doing as a unit anymore. And so it all just kind of fell apart.
That series of events where your family are no longer part of the ICOC. I recall you mentioning something in your ICSA talk where somebody outside of that says, "Oh, yeah, that group's a cult," and you're a child at this point, and you're like, I don't think that's right. But then you end up finding a ton of resources that confirm all of this, and talk the listeners through that entire experience, because what's significant about the emails that you sent me about your experiences was not so much identifying parts of your childhood to unpack, but more so that point at the age of 12 where you're like, oh my goodness, how do I live without this group? Not how do I escape from this group, which is typically the narrative that comes through during these interviews.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I think that is what is unique about my story, is that I wanted this to all be true. I wanted, and I think I say that in my ICSA talk too. Like I was right on the edge of like, I'm about to study like, I think the summer before I went to summer camp, and like there was a girl there, like an older girl, that like braided my hair and like read the Bible with me and prayed with me. And I was like in my head, I was like, one day I'll be like you, I'm sure she was like a year older than me. But like, that was just so, and again, this is something that this is a point I want to make too, that I feel just so passionate about, is that the children in these groups believe what you're telling them. At least in my experience, I think when you're before, I didn't have that typical experience of being in such a horrifically abusive environment that I was like, oh, this is terrible and I need to leave. Like that wasn't my experience, right? But I think for a lot of children who grow up in these environments, they really believe what you are telling them. They believe, like with the faith of a child, like just total abandonment. They're like, because this is all we know. You're telling us this, and this is all we know. So I'm gonna believe it. Like, right? I don't know anything else. And I'm trusting you, the adults, that you have it figured out and that this is what my life is going to look like. And I think that that was the hardest part. One of the hardest parts for me was just it was just that I grew up in this utopia that did not exist. And so, and it's just like, what is it? That experience of like having an existential crisis at 12, like, what is that? Like, that's just, you know, that's weird. Like, I don't even know how to describe it sometimes, but I'll describe what happened. So my friend, this is around the time that the Henry Crete letter came out, and a lot of people were leaving the church and a lot of the abuse was uncovered, right? And one of my good friends hadn't been at church in a while, and I went on AIM and I was like, hey, where have you been? And she was like, oh, we don't go there anymore because it's a cult and they steal people's money. And she had this way of saying things where she was like, I know something you don't, and like, I feel really good about it. And like, because when you're 12, that's kind of like how you talk. And I think too, I want to say like, I was so deep in the church. I don't know. I'm guessing because she seemed to be like, I don't know. I don't know how that experience of finding that out for her was, but I do think that she had other family like that was outside the church. I don't think it was as deep as it was for me and my family. So when I heard this, I was like, my brain broke. And I was like, I don't know how to exist anymore because what? And I was very confused, but I went on Google because Google was becoming a thing at that time. And I found out all this information, like, yeah, like BBC, Fox News, ABC News, Inside Edition with Barbara Walters was like, is this a cult? And like, again, if you have to ask, like, if it's a cult, like, it probably is. So I was reading this and I didn't understand what that meant at all. Like, I understand the confusion around that word. Um, and at the time, of course, at 12, I didn't know what that meant, but just the concept of my church being a place that's causing harm, that is known not for all the good things that they do and for all the people that they help, but for all the people that they're harming was just broke my brain. And I didn't know what to do with that. And then, a few months after that, I just went into the hardest time of my life. And so we're just everything fell apart. Like I didn't feel safe at home because of abuse that was happening. My parents pulled us out of school. We were been public schooled our whole lives, like, and my mom pulled us out in the middle of 7th grade. So I was with my brothers during the day and like they both had full-time jobs and I was left on my own with them. And then a few months after that, we moved from Nashville, Tennessee to Washington Heights, Manhattan. Yeah. And people would say, wow, it sounds like a culture shock. And I remember thinking, yeah, like, yeah, like, and it's interesting too, because even the people that like my parents started attending a healthy church when around the time I was 15. And even the people that I loved dearly that mentored me and that were there for me through some of the things that I was going through, I don't think they even knew that I was in a cult because I hadn't been telling people that. I didn't understand what that meant, but I did know that the ICOC was not a good place, especially when I started going to this new church. It was just like night and day of a different experience of like, oh my God, like, I get it now. Like, I get it. Like, and I think that's the key is that, the more that you just start to experience life and start to experience communities in different communities, secular, not, religious or whatever, I don't know, a chess club, like, the more that you are involved in different communities, the more that you see how the system of what you grew up in, how it works and all the ways that it's controlling and it's not healthy, and it's not like anything else, but but that was my experience, and it was just very shattering to me. And I just think it's really cruel too. I just want to say I think it's really cruel to children to 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 have kids and, what's the word I'm looking for? Not rear, but, feed them, clothe them, take care of them year after year, and give them this idea that life is one way, and then it's not at all, because it doesn't set you up for any type of success. It doesn't set you up for success in anything, because if you're so indoctrinated that life works one way and that all these things are true and that there's no nuance, everything's black and white, there's an answer for every question, there's a solution for every problem, right? Life doesn't work that way, and you're not helping your kids at all. You're damaging them so much when you are setting them up, when you're taking care of them in an environment like that, and they're growing in an environment like that. It's not growth. It's not growth. And yeah, and it's just all of it too is just a very codependent environment, one of my favorite quotes, and I put it on my podcast website, it's on the front page, is from Fred Rogers. I'll also say, if anybody's looking to heal from their time growing up in a cult, like Fred Rogers, like Mr. Rogers, seriously, like I will watch it with my kids and I'll just like start bawling because I'm like, why didn't I hear this as a child? It's like, it's just like such a balm for me, the things that he says, because he did that. He did that really well. He helped children understand not only themselves, but also the world that they were growing up in and what life is really like, on a very in a very healthy way, and in a way that like kids can understand.
Do you know who does that in our house? Bluey. That's who does it.
Oh no, Bluey. I was watching Bluey yesterday with my kids and I started crying, and my husband's like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "I'm okay. I'm fine. I'm fine." I'm just like,
In our house, that is Bluey, though, the person that's like, this is the life. But just watch Bluey for good, simple life lessons, but also a lot of fun, parenting hacks, all sorts.
Yeah, there's so much depth to it though. Like you can, and it's funny, I think my mom casually said once, she was like, "I didn't really let you guys watch Mr. Rogers because I thought it was boring." And I'm like, "Mom." I'm like, "Damn it."
Boring. You're boring. You're the boring one, Mum.
Exactly, right? Like, but there's so much depth there. But one of my favorite quotes he says is, love is generally confused with dependence. And those of us who have grown in true love know that we can love only in proportion to our capacity for independence. And I'm quoting that because I grew up in an environment where independence and interdependence were not cultivated. We're not we're not seen as something that's good. It was so tightly controlled that it was stifling, and it really stunts your growth to just grow up in an environment like that. You get out into the real world and you don't know what to do at all. You don't know who to look to. You don't know anything about anything. And it's just it's really terrible.
Of course, by design, in a number of high control groups and high demand religious groups, is that you don't know that there's another way to live. Second and multi-generational adults, former children born and raised in destructive groups, have no idea that there's another option by design. But what you said about raising children and really not telling them that there are infinite ways, not just one way. There are infinite ways to exist, and choices you can make, and jobs you can have, and courses you can take, and friends you can have, and people you can date, and food you can eat, and clothes you can wear, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But to raise three children in that environment under the impression of the church, to heal a family, to, to have a perfect family under the church's instructions, and then to tell you at 12, we're leaving. This is the only life you know. This is the only way you've been taught. This is the environment you've existed in for your whole life. And now we're leaving. Like, to what? To where? How? What? I don't understand anything you've just said.
Yeah. And none of that was explained to us, like, not adequately at least at all, and I think that I really do my best to not to be anxious, but to be aware of what the experience is like for my children, because it's so different as an adult versus as a child, right? You could be going on a hike in the woods and you're thinking, oh, well, we're all doing the same things. We're walking through the woods. But it can be a completely different experience for the child. And I think that's what happened. I think my parents got swept up in this movement and they saw the things that were bad and they started to see the signs and they had the conversations and da 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 da. Meanwhile, we left but we were already indoctrinated. We're already like, but wait, I remember even once, when we first moved to New York, a few months in, my parents started they started visiting other churches. They still weren't sure what church they were going to be going to. And it was sad. There were a lot of people who like left the ICOC who like tried to start their own church thing, which is like too soon, maybe never. But yeah, there was a church called the Manhattan Church of Christ, in Manhattan. And to be honest, as far as like churches of Christ go, it's probably pretty like progressive or whatever. I don't know how you would, I don't know. I don't know where it falls, but there was a girl, we would go to like their youth group. And there was a girl there that like would like leave sometimes to smoke and like wore shirts that like you could see her belly and things like that. But she came to youth group and like I remember one time having a conversation with my parents and I can't remember, I think we were telling them like we didn't want to go to like youth group there or something. And my dad being like, why don't you want to go? And like I think it could have been me, it could have been my brother, but we were both like trying to make a point of like, well, and we pointed out this girl and we were like, well, she comes to youth group, but she just like isn't, she's not a Christian or something like that, right? And my dad looked at us and he said, how do you know she's not a Christian? She could be a Christian. And I remember getting mad at my dad because I was like, but you taught us that. Like, or if you didn't teach us that, the church did. And at least you need to take responsibility for that and acknowledge that if I at 13 am saying, oh, this girl's not a Christian, like, and I think that's the part that frustrates me is that like parents need to take responsibility. Like they need to understand that the experience of their kids going through in these environments was so vastly different. And whatever growth they had or whatever they went through, whatever process they went through, their kids didn't go through that. And so when you're leaving these groups or at least trying to heal things with your kids or whatever, you need to utterly defer to them and what they went through and what their experience was. Because 9 times out of 10, it was completely different than yours. And you need to take responsibility also just for the thing, children are sponges, so we heard things on Sundays, unless you're like very much combating the messages that the kids are hearing, like, or you're correcting them or whatever, like the kids are going to soak all that in and they're going to believe all of it. And I think it makes me mad too, because sometimes I think the children of these groups, the children of the ICOC believed the most, like we were the most faithful. because of just being kids and just being told all these things. We were like, yeah, this is true, you know. And yet now we're the ones with, you know, CPTSD trying to, you know, I don't know, have healthy relationships and, you know, find therapists and just live our lives, you know. So
that is the end of part 2 of this mini-series on the International Churches of Christ. To find out more, you can visit cultvaultpodcast.com, or to catch up with me, you can email me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast.